Welcome, everyone. For those of you that are just joining, we'll give another few seconds for others to join, and we'll be starting right at the top of the hour. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Mark Herndon, Chairman of the M&A Leadership Council, and we're delighted that you've joined us for this important webinar, Avoiding Classic Mistakes in Due Diligence. You know, due diligence has always been hard, even for those organizations with an outstanding skill set and deep deal count history in their organizations. We find that companies still continue to struggle with leadership roles, governance, decision rights, and it's gotten even harder with regard to COVID potential adjustments to EBITDA and expanded inquiries in human resources and organizational risks for COVID. So we're going to take a deep dive with an expert panel today on these topics, and I'm delighted to introduce three outstanding subject matter experts in the entire field of M&A with a particular focus today on due diligence. We're joined today by Bruce Fleming, Executive Vice President of Strategy and Growth with Calumet Specialty Products Partners, a leading independent producer of high-quality specialty hydrocarbon products in North America. Bruce has deep experience in the energy sector with prior experience in many multiple senior corporate development roles, M&A, strategy and operations roles with Amoco Oil, Orient Refining, and Tesoro Corporation, where he led the acquisition of BP's Carson, California refinery, a deal that Barron's later noted as acquisition of the year. Bruce has a doctoral degree in chemical engineering from Princeton University and is a certified M&A specialist and also a founding member of the board of M&A Standards. So Bruce, it's a delight to have you and your expertise with us today. Thank you for your service to the M&A community.
You bet. Appreciate the introduction. I'm looking forward to hearing from some of the attendees about things that are on their mind.
Excellent point. Tiffany Donato serves as partner of Preston's Capital Group, where she serves as a strategic advisor, transaction execution principal, and a resource for investment and management within the hospitality and real estate sectors. Prior to this role, she served as Senior Vice President of Capital Strategy and Real Estate for Hyatt Hotels Corporation, where she led over the past 15 years over $14 billion in transaction volume in all various transactions across the portfolio. Now, particularly relevant to today's conversation, Tiffany also served a number of years ago as a team member on a special team during the global financial crisis, as that organization was working out very complex acquisitions, partnerships, divestitures, workouts, and other investment and growth mechanisms as they were rebalancing the portfolio. Tiffany brings an MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, as well as an undergraduate degree from Cornell. And she has lectured at both of those organizations in hotel investments and strategic management. So Tiffany, your experience is extremely relevant to our topic today, and we want to thank you for your investment back to the M&A Leadership Council and M&A community. Welcome.
Great, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Turning now to Mary Chico, who serves as Senior M&A Director with Willis Towers Watson, where she focuses on complex global M&A transactions, joint ventures, divestitures, and spinoffs. Prior to joining Willis Towers Watson, she spent over 20 years as a Senior HR M&A Officer and Executive with General Electric in a variety of due diligence and integration roles. She designed, developed, and implemented global HRIS, pay, benefits, and ERP solutions, as well as had responsibilities for integration-related organization design, staffing, selection, and stakeholder communications. Mary has a master's degree in organizational development from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and is noted as a Six Sigma Green Belt. So Mary, I have to say we've shared the podium on a lot of different M&A Leadership Council workshops and training programs, and you and your expertise and your entire team at Willis Towers Watson are just tremendous partners and sponsors to the M&A Leadership Council. So thank you, Mary, for your time today and your investment back into the M&A Leadership Council.
Absolutely, Mark. Really looking forward to the discussion today.
Wonderful. Bruce, to kick us off, you and I had a unique experience a few years ago. You were serving as deal team lead and chairman of the executive committee on a large transaction in your organization that you would ask us for some support on. And I saw you in action, And I learned that you have a very important viewpoint with regard to the role of executive leaders and corp dev leaders during a transaction. I'd like you to pick up from there. What do we need to do to get the organization, the decision rights, and the leadership elements of due diligence right?
Sure, happy to. And for the audience, I'm only going to make 3 points. I'm going to make 1 point on each of 3 slides, and it's going to start to really pick up the pace now. So, you know, when you pick up the paper and somebody has had an absolutely spectacular failure, like we bought it 3 years ago and we're going to sell it today for 10% of what we paid, that's happening at the top. That's in the dotted red circle. And the way you get there is, you know, a breakdown in strategy or a breakdown in information that flows up. I call the box structure here because Galbraith did. That's where I borrowed this from. But if the information's not flowing up from the people doing the diligence, then the folks making the decisions can't use it. Got a blind spot. So the classic error is not recognizing that these 2 things need to be joined up. So that's the first point. What can the diligence team do to help with that? That's on the next slide. And this, you know, the corporate development guys tend to catch it, reel it in, throw it to the diligence team, and disappear off to the, you know, the next one. Don't let them do that. And I'm the corp dev guy that we're talking about here. Passing the baton is just a chance to drop the baton. So, you know, our process doesn't let that happen. This is a 6-step slide from the M&A Partners folks. I like it. Inside each one of these, if you've worked with it before, it just keeps unpacking, and there's a tremendous amount of material, checklists, and information. And I use that for the same reason pilots do. I can fly without it, but why would I take the chance of forgetting one thing? So, you know, if the corp dev people from the very beginning when they're chasing to the very end where we've caught it, started it up, got the synergies out of it, and done the look back to the board, if you maintain that continuity, you're not going to be able to drop the baton. So that's the second point. And then the last thing I'd like to suggest is on the final slide, or my final slide. I'm not going to read this to you. I think I'll talk here for a minute and I'll let the audience eyes wander around. And if there are any questions, we can take them later on. But, you know, the third point here is the one I'm harping on today. If you can maintain that continuity, and really it's the continuity strategy. So the corp dev people know why they were chasing it. They know what they intend to do with it if we catch it and connect it on. And they can represent senior leadership's views, and they can also talk to the deal subject matter teams, for example, the diligence teams, the several of them. And, you know, it's an excellent spot to keep the whole organization connected. All of the other points on here are just ways, devices, formalities for keeping people talking to each other in real time as the whole thing unfolds. So the plug is, if you continuity all the way through, and the best in class organizations will take the corp dev guy that ran this and make him the head of the new business, him or her the head of the new business. That's accountability. You know, that puts real teeth in accountability. Go ahead and deliver all those promises you made. And I like that model. Haven't convinced my company to adopt it yet, but hope to ride off into the sunset on one of the businesses. Mark, back to you.
Fantastic, Bruce. Thanks. And there's a number of things here that I know we'll get some questions on as we open it up. So to all participants, I would encourage you to use the questions dialog box in the platform. We'll give a couple of instructions on that in a slide forthcoming. But keep those questions in mind. And in the meantime, Tiffany, let's transition to you. We are hearing nonstop these days about EBITDAC. Take over from there. What is it? What should we do about it? How do we think about it?
Yeah, it's a little bit the elephant in the room or the meme in the room right now. There's a lot of articles about it. There's a lot of talk about it. And instead of reading the slide, I'll kind of touch on a couple key points to keep in mind. First of all, EBITDAC is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and coronavirus, which is the new qualifier to something. And I think what's important to address, and first with the qualifier, that I'm not an accountant, my business partner is. So I'm approaching all of this from the standpoint of how does it apply to your due diligence? What are the key things to look for? I'm sure accountants have their own issues with EBITDA as it stands, but I think that is an important thing to take into account when you're looking at EBITDAC. Ebitda itself became popular in the 80s. It's primarily used as a way to compare the short-term operational efficiency of a firm while taking out some non-operating factors or intangible assets. It's extremely helpful to compare companies with different capital investment, debt, and tax profiles by carving out things that are really made based on a tax or accounting decision, as opposed to the actual operational efficiency of the business. And that's why it has on its own become a very popular tool within the industry, and particularly when you're looking at an acquisition or you're doing due diligence comparing one company to another, it's helpful from that role. But as always, EBITDA, even before this extra qualifier, does have some issues where if you're not looking at other metrics, it can ignore an aging asset burden, it can ignore high interest debt obligations, it can frequently ignores working capital requirements that I'll get into later, and can also ignore things like the aging of copyrights, patents, and other intellectual property. However, it's an extremely valuable tool, and part of why it's so valuable is because industries have done a good job of somewhat regulating a metric that is a not GAAP measure. Obviously, accountants try to stick to the GAAP measures. EBITDA is not GAAP, so it's a qualifier on itself. And then you add this extra C at the end that's expands it all over again. So a lot of accountants roll their eyes already, and then you add this and they just kind of don't want to look at it. It was a warning from accountants in April. Hey guys, please be careful about doing this. It went viral in May, at least amongst nerdy social media, like myself, and amongst accountants and diligence professionals as a coffee mug. Later in May, it was both used by a very large German company in an earnings report and as a statement, and it was somewhat ridiculed a little by Moody's of saying there's more coffee mugs than actual reconciliations based on this. As you got further into the summer, you started seeing a little more actual use of this. It's being used in some earnings call, it's being used in discussions with lenders, it's being used in acquisition disposition discussions. It's creating a big bid-ask spread as it relates to what is that C adjustment, and is that a forever adjustment or was it a one-time thing? But we're seeing large variations in how it's being applied and how it's being used. But I think a lot of it comes down to the audience and the intent. So for example, in earnings calls, shareholders like it as an idea of, is this still a good business? Should I still be owning this stock? Is it still there? The analysts don't really like it because they're trying to translate it and do their jobs to compare how companies are doing within an industry. Again, EBITDA was pitched as a cash flow metric to compare companies, and now includes non-existent operations, some actual expenses. Some companies are putting some projected sales or what they would be. So again, it's further tarnishing something that's supposed to be a comparative measure within an industry. And I think overall, the bigger concern is cash on hand, and this adjustment kind of takes away what that calculation was supposed to be. But the focus seems to be on current liquidity from analysts and lenders, but shareholders like this idea of what's the business viability and how would it have done if this coronavirus impact hadn't happened. With lenders, what we've seen so far is if you are current on payments, but you're triggering some covenant defaults on loans, I think some lenders are trying to get to a point where they can accept EBITDAC because they don't want to foreclose. So I think that goes to the motivation a little bit. The lenders don't want to foreclose. They don't want to own the asset. If they've got the flexibility within the lender structure to accept EBITDAC for a covenant, at least in the short term, that seems to be happening. But if you've got CMBS debt and special servicers, they probably don't have that flexibility. And if you're trying to get new capital, all of a sudden the lenders don't like it so much to take that new risk to put new money out the door. As far as new investments, there have been some companies, actually one here in Chicago was able to raise millions of dollars in junk bonds, kind of using this EBITDAC of here's how we would have done and here's how we're going to grow. Other than that, I've seen pretty limited use of this for new capital, for new investments. I think there are some side discussions for mezz or pref equity that people are getting to try to fill their capital stack in the meantime. They're using it, but really more of a forecast versus a trailing metric. And overall, like I said, I don't like to read slides to people, but at the bottom, I think how useful this metric is largely depends on the industry and a little bit of self-discipline in making it work. Again, EBITDA that originally started in the 80s, a little bit of a Wild West, became something more valid because within industries and within CFOs and accounting firms, there was a little bit of regulation that it became a useful comparison tool. If industries now can do a little bit of that, even just controlling themselves and get some sort of consistency, it's a very useful tool of how did company A handle shutdowns versus company B. So if they can align with, we're only going to add back expenses, but we're not going to throw in some projections or whatever that might be. I think the longevity of this as a tool, as opposed to a metric, really depends on the industries and who's using it, and kind of use without abusing, because it is a very helpful tool and it's a very helpful glimpse. There's rare points in time that you can actually have a downside scenario that's got some numbers behind it of what did it actually cost to shut down and what did it actually cost to restart. So it's a useful measure, but people have to rein it in a little bit and get some consistency to the point where it becomes a comparative tool once again. And then if we want to flip to really kind of the meat of today's discussion a little bit more on avoiding common mistakes in due diligence. And you'll see that there's areas of what I'm going to discuss that overlaps with what Bruce already said and overlaps a little bit with what Mary will dig into as well. The target I have in the corner kind of speaks to Bruce's point of you have to have the strategic alignment, and this decision was made at the top to look at this asset, to look at this deal, to kind of target this. If you don't have that strategic alignment up front, the deal doesn't make sense. However, where I've seen common mistakes happen more frequently is either as you get closer to that target, whether it's through execution plan changes or just financial diligence plan changes, if you don't go back through that dotted line that Bruce pointed out and make sure you're circling back with the strategic decision of why it worked in the first place, you can find yourselves a little far off the target, or at a point where you're presenting a done deal and it no longer fits the alignment of what senior leadership actually wanted it to be. So you have to completely revisit, completely circle back with top leadership to make sure that any changes that are being made through the diligence process or to the execution plan still fall into everything. Overall, with financial diligence, and I kind of joke that everything's financial, because if you're looking at something, it's going to impact the number in one way or another. Although obviously there are strategic considerations with charity or image or PR or things that have other intentions there. But in large part, when you look at something from a financial diligence standpoint, you want to say, does this question or does this document impact my quality of earnings, my income statement and balance sheet, my working capital, my tax and accounting treatment, or all of the above? So we can quickly run through a couple areas where it's tough to manage anyway, and then you add on a COVID complication that gets a little crazy. So just to touch on a few of them that I think are overly impacted. From the physical due diligence standpoint, obviously the fact that there's less travel overall impacts the fact that people are relying on pictures or videos a little bit more than on-site diligence. How much that matters kind of depends on the asset. Are you repositioning or are you just stepping in? From tax and accounting, obviously EBITDAC is something that needs to be considered there. Technology overall has become even more important than usual. People are working from home. Does the cybersecurity fit? Does everyone have the equipment to run the operation in the same way? And then I'll focus a little bit more on legal and how that really falls into financial diligence. When you've had the employee turnover that's going on in most companies right now, and when you've got reliance on reps and warranties in your due diligence, is the knowledge party in your contract someone who's been in charge of this for 2 weeks or 20 years? And you have a lot of shifts in that expertise. So one of the biggest things here is increase your focus on the knowledge party. Are they the right person? Can they ask the questions, or do you need to expand that list? And it also increases the need for estoppels from all of these third parties. If you have a knowledge party with a little bit of limited experience, or even if the lender is just behind on their documentation of things that impact the SNDA, I think the importance of estoppels and knowledge parties is bigger even than it normally is in these circumstances when you have so many moving pieces and so many documents and so many transactions moving quickly. And again, all of this gets impacted by who is your seller. So if you're dealing with the equity holder, you have a lot of dialogue, a lot of back and forth, a lot of Q&A. If you're buying just a note from a lender, they will share with you what they've received from the equity partner, but they may not really have an ability to go in and dig in and answer your extra questions. If you were buying real estate or something else through a UCC foreclosure, good luck, you get what you get, and then you've got to quickly dig into due diligence, but you're not always going to get all of your questions answered. And that kind of circles back up to the commercial tip to mitigate. You've got to run scenario analysis, and you have to expand that in the situation for a downside bigger than what most people have considered in previous transactions.
Tiffany, there's so much to unpack here.
There's a lot, yeah.
What would be a final observation from this slide? And What would be some good questions for our group of participants to be thinking about for later in the discussion?
I think the overall, again, ties back somewhat to what Bruce said, that you need to kind of revisit everything. I think anyone who's worked with me knows I have a due diligence checklist that's a little bit of a monster, but also you can't fall in love with the check mark next to something. Just because a document has been received and reviewed, that doesn't mean your work is done. And I think people have a tendency to fall in love with that check mark as it's something that's been complete. You have to revisit in the context of, is that something that was okay early on, or now it needs to be re-reviewed in light of something else happening? So as much as no one likes to revisit something that's already been crossed off the list, you need to revisit all of those multiple times, and you need to have some cross-functional accountability. So if someone did a review of the physical plant, but then operations has a change that involves moving walls or some sort of assumptions that are actually going to require physical changes on site, your PIP or your property improvement plan needs to now change from what it was of what the building needed to also adapt to what operations might be assuming or what legal might require. So I think revisiting the checklist multiple times, and to Bruce's point, kind of circling back all the way up and all the way down, make everyone revisit what they already reviewed, or at least confirm that they don't think any of this new information has created new changes.
Listen, that's really helpful, Tiffany, and there's so much here that I want us to get into in the Q&A portion. So participants, I would encourage you to go ahead and use your Q&A dialog box, submit some questions for Bruce, Tiffany, and Mary, and we'll tee as many of these up as we can in just a few minutes. Before that, however, Mary, transitioning to you, organizational and human resources due diligence has grown substantially, and it's almost top of mind for most organizations, and yet even in some of the areas of common HR and organization due diligence, we find that there's more smoke than fire. There's more talk than action. Take off at that point and, wire us into a little bit more about what should a skillful acquirer really be looking at a full scope HR due diligence, and how does that change now that we're post-COVID?
Great, thank you, Mark. So you want to acquire company X, and you want to acquire that company because you want the intellectual capital, which resides in the heads of the people and the talent. So when you go into due diligence from a people perspective, you really need to look at three key areas: the financial components that are associated with employees, the talent, people themselves, and then the organizational culture. So from a financial perspective, that really relates to the policies, the plans, the benefits, any kind of executive contracts, change in control agreements, any underfunded liabilities, oftentimes in international deals that would reside in the DB plan. So you want to know what's there. Then when you look at the talent, why are you doing this deal? Are you doing this deal, as I said before, because you need that talent and the intellectual property resides in the heads of the employees? Also, who is the leadership that you need to identify, attract, and retain? And then the other piece that you need to look at is the organizational culture. So when I talk about culture, I'm not talking about national culture. That's something we should all be aware of as we work internationally. I'm really talking about the operational culture, how work gets done every day in your organization as well as the organization of the target. So really being able to focus on those three areas are really very important. Next slide. Great, thanks. So it's a lot easier in a due diligence to be able to focus on the financial components that surround employees. Employees cost money, so you need to understand what that is. It's a little bit harder when you're trying to assess the talent in due diligence. Who are the people needed to get the deal closed? Who are the people needed to stabilize the business? And who are the people needed to grow the business? So you really need to look at those three areas very, very closely. And then what are the roles and positions? Do we need all the roles with the target? Not every person, not every role is as critical. So you're really trying to hone in on the key talent. And again, during due diligence, this is not easy. You have very, very limited access to the talent within the organization below the executive or C-suite level. So you have to get really creative. Something that we've found in a lot of our research is that the best way of figuring out who the right talent is within an organization is to ask the target directly. Now, like anything in due diligence, you will go back and verify and do a little bit more digging once you progress in the process. And I'm sure many of you have heard that most deals fail because the cultures don't align. Again, you need to go back to why you're doing the deal, understand how you operate your business, understand how the target operates their business, and determine what might need to change to bring the two businesses together. And so culture doesn't have to be this nebulous thing. It's basically, here's why we're doing the deal. This is what our organization looks like. This is what their organization looks like. This is how their sales force goes to market. This is how our sales force goes to market. If there is a delta, then that needs to be identified and communicated in order to get the full value out of the deal. If you go to the next slide.
Okay.
So with COVID, it's just made due diligence so much more complicated. So there's 3 areas that you really need to focus on during the due diligence process. You need to understand the business exposure of the target, the work environment, the work location, and any new policies that had been put into place. And then how you're going to have, or excuse me, how the target is managing resources and keeping their employees engaged. So if you go to the next page, and to Tiffany's point, we all have these due diligence checklists, right? That for every single function, whether it's HR, finance, tax, legal, there's 300 items on that checklist. Now you've got to focus on a few more things because of COVID. So from a business exposure perspective, you need to have an understanding of how COVID has impacted the target. What has been the exposure to the employees themselves? Are there employees within this organization that are deemed critical? So if your target is a manufacturing or pharmaceutical manufacturing company, for example, there are certain employees that from the beginning of COVID had to go in every day and do their job. So you need to know if that's part of what's going on in the target. And then has the target relied at all on any kind of government support? So those are just a few things that you really want to dig deep and try to get the answers to as best you can. When you look at the environment and the work location, so unless you are deemed a critical employee and you have to be making the drug, manufacturing a drug, again, I'm using a pharmaceutical company as an example, what are the other employees in that target? What do they need to do? What do they need to get done? And how have they been impacted by COVID? What policies from a work location perspective has the target put into place? You need to understand what their work from home policies or remote work policies were pre-COVID and post-COVID. And then what percentage of the staff, again, is deemed critical and actually has to be in an office? And if they do have to be in an office, what provisions is the target putting in place to make sure it is a safe and controlled environment? And then last but not least, really focusing on how the employees are doing in the target. Is the target business keeping their thumb on the pulse of what's going on with employees? Are employees feeling like they're being communicated to? Has the target had to put into place any kind of furloughs, reduction in force, salary decreases, or pull back on bonuses? All those things are really, really critical to you, especially if you're doing a deal because you need the talent. You need to understand how this has impacted them so that you're able to move forward.
Mary, that's excellent. I know we're going to get a number of questions about all 3 of these areas. And with that, why don't I go ahead and start our Q&A discussion with each of our 3 outstanding panelists here. And those of you joining us on the webinar, please submit your questions through the Q&A dialog box on your control panel, and we will address as many of those as possible. We've got a number of them that have already come in, and Bruce, you kind of kicked off with a very strong topic here, and a question that has just come in talks about, Bruce, what you mentioned about corp dev role extending throughout the entire life cycle of M&A. You gave one example of corp dev lead being asked to lead the acquired business, But this question says, what are other incentive alignment mechanisms to provide accountability to the business from Corp Dev? Bruce, help us out with that. What are some other incentive or alignment ways that we can create that strong link between a continuing Corp Dev lead role post-close?
So I like the question. I usually think about it the other way around. I've got kind of a servant leader model going most of the time. And I think Corp Dev needs to be accountable to help the business, help the diligence teams, help the senior executives to get to the right conversation and the right result. But the fact is, in the real world, in everybody's company and in mine too, Corp Dev looks a lot like the leader. You know, they look like the top of the org chart, making all this stuff happen. And so the alignment goes a couple ways, and then the incentives should follow from that. One that I like is the stream of work leads, and so that diligence teams have lots of pieces. There's the tax person, there's the site physical asset person, there's probably some commercial contracts hanging around that are going to transfer intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. Each of these picks up a subject matter lead. You put them together into a committee, you make that the deal team. It's always customized, it's always unique and different to the deal itself, but that team, special recognition for that team is one of the tricks that I like to use. And special recognition is, the CEO or the chairman of the board takes that small team out. By the end of the deal, 100 people helped, but a pretty small group actually made it happen and held it together in terms of the conversation that I want, continuing, not dropping the baton, all of that. And so you can come back later and say, boss, these are the ones that did it. I like them to have that recognition. Maybe there's a plaque or a token they can hang on the wall. There's all sorts of small ways to tell people, I know you were the one that made the difference on this deal.
Excellent. Bruce, thank you for that. Let's go to Tiffany. Tiffany, we've got a question here about EBITDAC. I'm sure we'll get a number of questions, and there's a ton coming in, so keep submitting questions, folks. But with regard to EBITDAC, the question says, will this extend beyond 2020? How long will we be talking about EBITDAC as an adjustments to earning?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I would say there's probably two pieces to that answer. One being, if we live in a world where somehow magically all of this impact is done at the end of the year and everyone's behaviors are the same and everything else, this measure is going to continue to be used as a comparison. It's always, what is your growth from the prior year? Where is your trend line? So I think once there is some sort of established basis for what EBITDAC will be for these companies, they're going to continue to refer to it. So for example, if next year someone says we have 80% growth from 2020, that sounds a little bit crazy. They're going to have to also normalize it and say, well, that was a blip. Here's the asterisk that is forever by 2020. But that also could continue. What are we deeming? Again, this goes to the regulation of what's the C in the EBITDAC. Is it from just the shutdown? Or are you going to start to say, hey, this is still EBITDAC because travel hasn't worked its way back? Or this is still EBITDAC because people are not leaving their homes as much or they're working from home. So a lot of that will come down to what is that C from industry to industry. And some industries may carry it longer than others, but I think it is kind of forever going to be used as an asterisk for 2020. And how much it continues really depends on what industries are going to deem a COVID issue versus just an overlying economic issue and recovery issue.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Mary, here's one about COVID-19 and organizational due diligence. And the submitter says, we're doing a due diligence exercise right now. What do I do if I can't get answers to the organization's response to COVID-19 with regard to the workforce?
So, and I think that's absolutely critical that you do get a response. And here's where you have this point during due diligence where you need to decide as a leadership team if you're comfortable moving forward without getting that answer that you're asking for. What I would recommend, because I've been in situations with clients before and sat in the management presentation meetings where things haven't been answered. You just have to say, we need this answer. We need to understand what we're buying. And because the people are so important to this deal, we need your help getting there. And then you might get the answer, you might not get the answer, and then it's a you have to figure out as a business whether you're ready to take another step forward and risk not getting that answer.
Fantastic.
If you are ready to
yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mary. Yeah.
If you are ready to take a step forward with due diligence, it's iterative, right? You're going back and forth. It's not a linear process as much as we would all like it to be. So for things that you don't get the answers to during the due diligence process or early in the due diligence process, you just continue to come back to it over and over again if you decide to move forward.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm going to throw this next question out to the entire panel. I'd really be curious to get everyone's reactions to this. And it comes from a Malc alumni. Julie, great to have you with us today, and thanks so much for this question. It's really a good one. Julie says, in this time of failed businesses, do you have suggestions for validating a target's client base? Really important. We haven't talked about that so far. Who wants to take a first shot at that? How do you validate the target's client base?
I can weigh in just a little bit on that. It's an increasingly difficult problem and industry specific. So to give a hotel example, obviously you've got a lot of history, group bookings, transient bookings, volume accounts, and a common thing we always kind of tell people to make sure of is that client base at all reliant on the existing ownership or some agreement with existing ownership. Example I'll give of that is there was a hotel in Dearborn, Michigan. It had a very strong client base from the Ford plant. Well, Ford also tells all of their vendors or anyone coming to meet with them that you should stay at one of the hotels that they own, and they were selling the hotel. So as part of the diligence of it, you had to kind of go through and say, this is great client history. Is any of that dependent on the ownership structure, or will that somehow veer based on the ownership structure? But overall, I know it's a qualifier. It's very industry specific. But I think any sort of documentation you can get in history is always kind of the best way to look at it, and go very far back in your history and see what those trends were. And again, it goes to my commercial point. Make sure you're paying attention to what the competition is doing as well. If you were doing well in a market because you're the highest level of something, but something's under construction in town, that's a higher level, you need to take that into account in your forecasting of the client base, and not only where it is and where it has been, but where it's projected to go.
Fantastic. Bruce, how about your thoughts?
Well, I'll change the word to customer. Most of the transactions I've been involved with were, business to business, customer based. And look, the short answer is you're going to have to call them. You're going to have to get the buyer permission to call those customers. The seller doesn't want to do that. So that's the catch-22. Especially if you're running a multi-step process. If I have 6 people remaining, and if I'm on the sell side, they all want to talk to my customers. The answer is no. You're not going to disturb my customers. Maybe the last guy can do it as a confirmatory due diligence. So that's where the seller is going to come from, and the buyer's like, well, I have to talk to them. How do I know they even like you? How do I know they're going to stick around if I'm the new owner? So you do that dance every time. In COVID world, I don't know. I think that it's harder, and the thing I'd probably point to is that the seller ought to at least give you an aging report, and if the customer base is deteriorating, it's going to show up there.
And I would just expand this question. I think Julie's on an excellent point here, and thank you, panelists, for teeing this up. But, I would also add vendors and partners. Think about supply chain risk now. There's more supply chain risk now than ever before. Organizations are really trying to de-risk that as a part of their strategic operations plan and portfolio plan. And you have to look at how COVID has impacted them. Where are they in their recovery plans? What degree of additional risk has that introduced for the deal and the valuation? So it is much harder now. Let's go into another question. Dan, also a Malc alumni. Dan, great to have you here. He says, I may be biased, but I think one of the best mitigation strategies when it comes to synergies, budgets, and risks is the early engagement of the IMO. Their involvement early, even as soon as LOI, can really cut down on communication gaps, oversights, and drops in key issues. Any reactions to that? When should you bring on an IMO, or sometimes we call it a DMO? What is that role, and when would you inject that into the overall process? Who wants to take that?
I agree with Dan's comment. If you mentally rewind, we had a 6-step model that happened to be the M&A partners model, but nobody runs it that way. And despite that, I was the one using the analogy. a lot of those steps run in parallel. And the earlier you get the next people who are about to come up on stage, the earlier you get them in, the more time they have to think about it, get their head around where we're headed, ask questions, get oriented, then they're ready to do a really great job. So yeah, bring people in early, in advance of the need.
Mary or Tiffany, any thoughts on that?
You know, I worked on a lot of very, very complicated deals in my career. And when it's a complicated deal, meaning it spans multiple countries, you know, just really high risk areas that you're doing business, in particular oil and gas, having the strategy firm, usually there is a strategy firm involved very early on. Typically, they become the person, the partner that's running the IMO, with senior leadership from the buyer and seller eventually sitting as part of that IMO. There's nothing more important in the context of a deal to have a framework for how work is going to get done and decisions are going to be made and how issues get rolled up the food chain. And the larger and more complicated the deal is, the more important it is to have that structure. It's kind of like having a project plan, right? You might know everything on the plan, and maybe you could think you can do it in your head, but when things start getting crazy and busy, it kind of becomes your true north. The IMO, the PMO, they become the true north of the deal. So you have that group that sits there, whatever their role is, to make sure that things are progressing in the right direction. Making sure that if you committed synergies to the street, you're a public company, those synergies are being attacked so that by 100 days post-close, you know, you're on the right track, and you're going to be able to preserve shareholder value. So for any large, complicated deal, that structure and governance is absolutely critical. And I've never, ever worked on a complicated deal or a mega deal that didn't have that in place.
Fantastic, really good insights. And I love that phrase, the true north of the deal. Very helpful way to remember that. Tiffany, we're getting a lot of questions about the process, the diligence process. How should the process be adjusted, et cetera? This one is going to go to you. The question says, when should you do the on-site physical review of the target company, especially in the post-COVID world? How important is that, or can we rely exclusively on some of the virtual and streaming kinds of on-site inspections?
No, I think the timing of that on-site somewhat depends on what the intention is with the asset itself. If you are buying something that's a little bit commoditized, or here's the model and your plan is just to go in and kind of change the operations themselves, but you're really relying just on, you know, what's the repair and maintenance, you're going to have a third party report, those types of things, that can probably wait a little bit longer. If there's going to be any sort of repositioning or any sort of change up, you need to get as many people in there early as you can, because it can dictate so many changes. So whether it's an example of reorganizing an office, well, then that would go to, you know, someone on Mary's team, or someone else might be looking at, well, that changes how many people can be here. So the physical plant dictates a lot of both the economic feasibility, the operational efficiencies, and how the people are even going to move around the space and how you can work your execution plan. So if you're planning any changes to that, you need to have people on site early, and you need to have some decision makers on site early. I think both in my experience with hotels, retail, even office, there's a lot of opinions that go about what the final product needs to look like and what it's going to cost. If you go down a path and a deal makes sense on one number, and then someone with a strong opinion comes in and says, we're going to change all of this, you have to change everything. So you want those opinions in early, you want that renovation or repositioning plan early, because it will dictate a lot of your financial valuation. And what you don't want to do is retrade on someone at the end. Once you've signed an LOI, you've been under diligence, if you're retrading because you've changed your mind on something, that's very different than wanting a price adjustment for something that you found in due diligence related to environmental or zoning or something else. So if the changes to the physical plant are something that is the buyer's opinion or the buyer's dictation, you want to make sure that you're very solid of those early in the process, because it's frustrating to both your own team and particularly the seller if you start changing your mind on those things and restructuring the deal later on.
Excellent advice. Thank you for that. Panelists, any other comments before we go to? Yeah, please.
Sorry. So I just want to bring to what Tiffany said, in particular for health and safety, from a health and safety perspective. if it's manufacturing and it's, in areas of the world where there's high risk. I'll just share a story with you. When I was with General Electric, the aviation business was getting ready to acquire another jet engine business that was in the Czech Republic. And during that site visit, pre-COVID, we saw that there was just on the manufacturing floor a huge hole right in the floor. And in North America or in different parts of Western Europe, we don't see that as much, right? But in other countries around the world, that could very well be. And without having some way of viewing the manufacturing plant, making sure all the safety signs are up and things like that, that's something that you really want to caveat until you get an opportunity to be able to do that, whether you use reps and warranties or however you do that. But some level of a site review needs to be done, even if it's being done where the seller is taking you through very carefully the manufacturing sites and plants.
Fantastic war story, Mary. Thank you for that. Hey, Bruce, I'm going to go to a question that has just come in, and it's off of your slide. This question says, Bruce mentioned provisions for effective dissent during due diligence. And the question says, how do you really create a forum for providing that effective dissent? And they go on to explain in this question, the deal room, the deal team, the pace, the pressure to generate the report on the compelling risk and issues, et cetera. How do you stop that momentum if there's a legitimate deal risk issue and you're a work stream lead deep in the deal room? How do you stimulate that from a leadership and executive viewpoint?
Yeah, so the effective dissent is the best safety net you can have. You've got to honor it. The way I do it, I referred to this a little bit already. So I stay with the team, start to finish as the corp dev lead. And when we assemble the stream of work leads on the subject matter front, a lot of times you've got very, very strong contributors who absolutely know their area, appreciate risk, let's say, appreciate what they're looking at in somebody else's business, but maybe don't have that C-suite executive polish and can't quite express it. The burden is on me to make sure I do the work to understand why they're concerned. If they can't tell you why they're upset and you blow it off, shame on you as the leader. And so the answer is you put in the extra work to understand why the subject matter person takes the position they do. And it's fascinating. I'll take a small tangent, but I've learned a whole lot more than I ever would have thought, maybe would have come up. All sorts of aspects of environmental regulation and condition of things. I find it fascinating. Those people know a great deal, and at the same time, they almost never get in front of the CEO because there's a conversational disconnect that happens there. So I broker that. It's super interesting, and it's just it's a small tidbit, but people have to be given a hearing when they're upset, and that it comes out emotionally. This is the wrong thing to do. This is not in the direction of goodness. Why? I don't know why we're doing this. You start to hear that grumbling. Listen real carefully. There's a reason for it.
Yeah, I think that's good. And we always encourage diligence leads and their respective work streams that they've got to get an oar in the water. They've got to have an opinion, not just render their recommendations and report, but they've got to have a go, no go, or modify kind of decision rendered to the deal team and the executive committee to really bring conclusion to what did we do about the data that we've captured. Part of that's cross-functional between the work streams in the different organizations, but ultimately it's everybody's responsibility to raise the flag as need be. There's a number of questions here about the buyer versus the seller role. And Mary, maybe you could take the first shot at this, but then I'd open it up to the panel as well, excuse me. And this is a two-part question. Number one, what advantage does the buyer have over the seller? And if you're the seller, what are tips for going through the due diligence from the seller's perspective? Mary, tee that up, and then I'll open that up to the rest of the panel.
So the advantages that the buyer has over the seller is they, they know what they're going after. They know what they want. They're trying to determine if the target is going to meet what they need to meet their deal goals. If you flip that, what the seller has that the buyer doesn't have is the buyer has to convince the seller to sell to them, right? So it's just not a foregone conclusion that if you've got a buyer that comes in there and they look great and everything's going well through due diligence, that the seller is going to want to sell their business to you, right? There's a lot of factors that come into play. And I think that oftentimes the buyer thinks that they have more of an advantage over the seller. Now, if it's a distressed asset, that's very different. And there's a lot of factors that come into play there. But from my perspective, when I'm working, because I work both sides of the deals with my clients, and I've done it when I was the M&A global leader at GE, oftentimes, the buyer feels like they have such an advantage over the seller, and that's just not the case.
Thank you, Mary.
What was the second question?
Any tips for going through an effective due diligence from the seller side?
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Tiff. No, please go.
I was gonna say I can speak to that a little bit, and it ties a little to what Mary said too, of where the leverage is and who has the information. One of the biggest recommendations I can make to prepare for due diligence as a seller is do all of your due diligence as if you're buying your own asset before you put on the market, before you put it out there. Figure out where the bodies are buried first, so that that's disclosed early on, and that's a disclosure while there's still a competitive bidding process, if that's applicable, versus letting it be something that the buyer finds out later on. And that speaks a little bit to there's timing of leverage within a transaction as a seller as well. If you are doing a competitive bidding process, or you're doing an LOI process, know what your deal breakers are as a company for your sale, and make sure that the people bidding on the asset or the company include what those provisions are, and negotiate that before you pick a winner. So that the LOI process, while it's still competitive and while people are still trying to win, is when you really need to push your deal breakers, because terms always change from the LOI to the full PSA, but you want to make sure that the things that are important to you and really are lines that you won't cross are defined while there's still another bidder waiting in the wings, and you still have some of that competitive pressure, if possible, that's out there.
Very good. Bruce, you've served on both sides of the table many, many times. Any additional thoughts to add to that?
No, I'll encapsulate it by saying, and Tiffany detailed this pretty well, but in a competitive process where you're going to do a formal data site, you're in pretty good shape, because if you stock that thing up first, on your own diligence on your own asset, and then the second part of that, as the bidders start with their questions and answer format through the data site, I like to wait about 3 days, because 6 of them are going to ask some variation of the same question, and you can write the answer one time and encompass all of that. It minimizes the wear and tear on your own team. I'd much rather be a buyer than a seller in terms of the diligence, because sellers are like one-armed paper hangers running around answering all these questions from every direction.
Yeah.
Trying to manage the burnout rate of your team on the sell side is an issue. So I like to slow the data site down a little bit, figure out the generic question instead of the exact one that they asked, and answer it.
Bruce, that's helpful. And I want to stay with you for this next question. Tony, who's an M&A Leadership Council alum, has asked a couple of excellent questions here. Bruce, if you'll take the first shot, and then I'm going to open it up to the panel in the few minutes remaining. But Tony's asked 2 excellent questions. And Tony, great to have you with us today. Really more about executive decision-making, corp dev strategy considerations. The question that Tony asked is taking into consideration the macroeconomic, the US, the global economy, politics, trade tensions, worsening overall kind of environment. How do you think about this in due diligence? What are other organizations doing, and what would this panel suggest as how those macro considerations, business environment considerations impact a particular target analysis? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll resolve that into 2 things. One of them I think Tiffany's already addressed through the EBITDAC. We're all going to be trying to figure out, is the current performance of the business better, worse, or the same, and is it because of COVID, and therefore is it liable to stay that way, or be sustainable, or is it a one-time? We're all trying to figure that out. It takes you to the forecasting dilemma. What's the world going to look like shortly? What's the world going to look like in 3 years and 7? And if you can't fill all that in, you can't run your discounted cash flow model, and you don't know what to pay for the thing you're chasing. So it's just really pretty crazy right now. So what you fall back on, and I think Tiffany covered that really well. So what you fall back on is, look, maybe the whole industry segment that I'm looking at is down, maybe it's up. There are winners in this. People running teleconferences and webinars are one. So, I want to know if I'm buying a maybe top quartile or at least top half entity, which is liable to be a survivor no matter what happens. So I think you pivot and you say, I'm having a little trouble with the valuation itself. Let me go to competitive advantage. Let me make sure that the thing that I'm acquiring is going to be the winner in its space, because I'm pretty sure the whole space is not going out of existence, but some of the individual players might be. Don't buy the one that's about to fail.
Fantastic. And it does tie into what both of you have commented on. And, we're seeing a lot of organizations push that question through, what are the customer behavior changes right now and going forward? How will this be a permanent or a longer term shift? And I know we've addressed both of those as well. So Tony, great question. We're going to end on this one, and then we'll just close off with some information about upcoming training programs with the M&A Leadership Council. But resourcing is so much a challenge for every acquirer, regardless of skill set and expertise internally. Tony's question again is, given the additional COVID risks, how do I think about resourcing my due diligence team? Do I need to have a backup as well as a primary diligence lead? Do I need to have more hands on deck to cover the same kinds of considerations within the scope and role of a due diligence, given the additional risks? It's a really insightful question. What do you guys think about that?
I would say it might depend a little bit on just what your existing resources are. I think what we're going to see is some companies that had the resources and on a run rate would look at, call it 3 to 5 acquisitions a year, and they were staffed to do that and able to essentially steal resources from other departments instead of having a dedicated diligence team. The way the business cycle might go now, I think people are assuming there's going to be a little bit of a flood of opportunities either later this year or early next. So is your company geared up to look at 3 to 5 things at a time versus 3 to 5 things over a year? Are you just borrowing resources from other departments to do that, or do you have a dedicated team? And then that also goes to where some people do bring in an outside view to kind of help manage the data room, to kind of be that double check on questions, to bring in some short-term leadership expertise as you're looking at the acquisition, but you don't necessarily need those people full-time as part of your corporate overhead. And there's a lot of firms that kind of help and do that. I call it bench strength. Sometimes you need a little bit more bench strength, and also you can capitalize it as a transaction cost if the deal happens instead of it being long-term corporate overhead. But I would say that question largely depends on what are your current resources. If you have a dedicated diligence team and kind of DMO, you're probably in better shape than if you're stealing from other departments, because depending on what industry you're in, those other departments may have also had furloughs and layoffs and reduction of force, and it's a lot harder to borrow people's time or at least get their attention and priority if it's not their day job.
Very true, Tiffany, well put, and I really appreciate that perspective. It's always such a challenging issue. Well, panelists, again, I want to thank you for your time today, your expertise, your investment into the M&A community. And on behalf of all of us at the M&A Leadership Council, we want to see you guys again at upcoming webinars as well as major training programs. We've been honored over the last 10 years to train over 4,000 executives and over 700 companies, and a hallmark of how we do what we do in the M&A Leadership Council is based on what you've seen today through deep subject matter corporate practitioners talking about real world experience, peer-to-peer learning, what will really help you and your organization with improved skill sets and execution across the entire life cycle. We do have a number of outstanding training opportunities coming up. Our next workshop on due diligence is going to be in the first week of October, online, of course. And let me just tell you a little bit about this workshop. We had over 50 people from all global regions join us at our prior online due diligence training program. And it's a highlight. We have one of the most outstanding individuals to provide a deep dive of what is financial due diligence for the non-financial executive. We'll get into this, that we're talking about quality of earnings, financial statements, how do we do adjustments, and how do we read behind the numbers to really get strategic insight on the valuation, the performance of the business. We'll be joined by one of Mary Chico's colleagues from Willis Towers Watson, taking us through a more detailed explanation of global organizational, people, and human capital risk, both financial and non-financial, with an interactive exercise that you do not want to miss. It's one of the highlights of this program. And then finally, we'll be joined by two of the M&A Partners team members that specialize in information technology and cybersecurity due diligence. And we'll unpack, what do you need to do? What do you look at? How do you get at cybersecurity risk, even from read-in of the deal, pre and post LOI, all the way through the journey? Within each of these modules, we'll be doing interactive exercises, direct dialogue, workouts, case studies, and it's a real highlight program. So we encourage you to check that out, as well as some of the other programs that we've got lined up for you throughout the fall. The Art of M&A for HR leaders, due diligence, which we just talked about. We're debuting a brand new training program called the Art of M&A IT Effectiveness in mid-October. And then some of our core programs, program management, integration, and we'll end the year strong with a special focus workshop on divestitures and carve-outs. So we look forward to hosting you again for upcoming webinars and training programs. And with that, thanks for joining us today, everybody. It's been a great discussion, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.